Hello students, welcome to Prime Educare, a complete institute for JEE and NEET. My name is Charul. I am IIT Delhi graduate and I have taught more than 25,000 students so far. So students, what we were studying? We were studying errors and measurements. So let's proceed further. So students, in the last lecture, we were studying about the base and the base and the scalar quantity. And what is we were doing base and vector, this numerical we were solving. So what we were studying about the base quantities, we were studying about the base quantities and about the derived quantities. So this we were studying that in physics we have various types of quantities. We have base quantities, we have derived quantities. So, and another type of how we have divided the quantities, we have divided into a scalar quantity and a vector quantity. So students, what is a scalar and a vector? A scalar which has only magnitude. What are the scalar quantity? Which has only magnitude. And what is a vector quantity? Which has magnitude as well as direction. So scalar has only magnitude and vector has both magnitude as well as direction. So vector has both magnitude as well as direction. So students, and what were the base and the derived quantities? Base quantities are those quantities which are fundamental. So these quantities are fundamental quantities, means they are not dependent on any other quantity, they are independent, and derived quantities are dependent on these fundamental quantities. So now this is just a revision of what was the base quantity, what was the derived, what was the scalar and what was the vector. Now students, let's solve this numerical. So let's first understand this numerical. So what is this numerical is saying? So let's first understand it. So numerical is saying that we have to classify the quantities. So these are the various quantities given. We have the displacement, we have the mass, force, time, speed, velocity, pressure and work. So we have, these are the various quantities and we have to divide these quantities whether they are base, derived and then scalar or vector. So now first let's understand the about each and every quantity. So first let's consider the quantity displacement. So let's first understand the quantity displacement. So what is displacement? So what is displacement? It is the shortest distance between initial and final point. So what is displacement, students? So displacement is the shortest distance between initial and the final point. So what is basically displacement? Displacement is the length. So displacement is the length. It is the total length covered. So displacement, students, is the total length covered by an object. So its unit is meter. Displacement is meter. Now this displacement has both magnitude as well as direction. So this displacement has both magnitude as well as direction. So what do we call it as? A vector quantity. So this displacement, here we have measured the length. So we call it as a base. So what all comes in the base quantities? What all comes in the base quantities? Mass, length and time. So here we are measuring the length. In the case of the displacement, we are measuring the length. So here in the case of the displacement, students, we are measuring the length measured. So this is a base quantity and its unit is meter. So where we will categorize it as, but the displacement has the direction also. But this displacement has a direction also, so we say it as a vector quantity. So what do we call it, where we will keep the displacement in? The base and vector. So displacement will be kept in base and vector. So displacement will be kept in base and vector. So in this comes as displacement. So if we say, so let me remove this first. So we have first A, base and vector, we have B, base and vector, base and scalar, base and vector, C, derived and scalar, and then we have derived and vector. So we have the first quantity, displacement. So where do we keep the displacement? What is displacement? Total length covered, but it also has the direction. So we will keep this displacement in base and vector. So displacement will come in the category of base and vector. So displacement will come in the category of base and vector. Now if we, so displacement will come in the category of base and vector. Now mass. What is mass? Mass is the total amount of matter contained in an object. So mass is a base quantity. It is not dependent on anything. So mass is not dependent on anything. Here we are measuring just its weight in kg. So mass will come in a scalar quantity as well as scalar. Mass will come in base and scalar because it has no direction. So this mass has no direction in it, so it will come in a scalar quantity, and it is the total amount of matter contained in the object. Now next quantity is force. So what is force? Force is the push or pull by an object. Force is the push or pull by an object. So where do we keep this force? So force is the push or pull by an object. So where we will keep this force quantity into it? We will keep this force quantity into the, force is mass into acceleration. So this force is mass into acceleration. So this force is dependent on mass, and this force is also dependent on acceleration. So that means it is dependent. Here it is not independent, it is dependent on mass and acceleration. So it is a derived quantity. So this force is a derived quantity, but it also has the direction in it. So force also has a direction, like we will always say about where is this force we will applying to, in which direction are we applying this force. So force is a vector quantity as well as it has dependent on other quantity, it is derived. So where we will keep it as derived and vector. So force will come in the derived and the vector quantity. It is dependent on the base quantities. It also has magnitude as well as direction. So we will keep this force in a category of derived and vector. So force is kept in derived and vector. Then we have time. So what is time? Time is the duration to complete a task. Like person starts when we are studying. Let's consider a case, we have to study. So we are studying a subject. So let's say we started our study like at say 10 a.m. and we have to complete 5 pages. So till 11 a.m. we will be able to, we have in 1 hour duration we were able to complete the 5 pages of, let's consider any science. So we are studying science and we started studying science at 10 a.m. until 11 a.m. we have completed 5 pages. So in how much time, in how much duration do we have completed that task? In 1 hour. So in 1 hour we have completed that task. So time is a duration to complete a task. But is this time quantity, this physical quantity time, is it dependent on any other quantity? It is the total duration. total duration to complete a task. But is the time dependent on anything? The time is not dependent on anything. It is a scalar as well as it has no direction. So where we will keep it as? In the first category, base and scalar. So the time is kept on base and scalar. Then comes the speed. What is the speed? It is the total distance covered per total time taken. Speed is the total distance covered per total time taken. So this speed is the total distance per total time taken. So if we say about the speed, speed has the unit of meter per second. So speed is dependent on the distance covered upon time taken. So speed is dependent on the distance covered upon time taken. So speed is a scalar quantity. It has no direction, but it is dependent on other quantities. It is dependent on other quantities such as the distance covered. Distance is the length covered and time is the duration. So it is dependent on the distance covered and the time taken. So where we will keep the speed into it? We will keep the speed into a derived, because it is why derived meaning, because it is dependent on the length, distance covered and the time taken. So it is a derived quantity, but it is also has only magnitude. So we will keep this speed into derived and scalar, so which is the case of here. So we will keep it here, which is a speed will come in the category of C, which is meaning derived and scalar. So speed will come in the category of derived and scalar. Then comes derived and vector. So students, then comes velocity. After speed, we have the velocity. So what do you understand by the velocity? Velocity is the total displacement upon total time taken. So velocity is the total displacement upon total time taken. So if we speak about the velocity, it is displacement upon time taken. So displacement is dependent, is a depend displacement is dependent, is not dependent, it is the length covered. So displacement is the length covered, time is the time duration. So it is not depend, it is, so if we talk about the velocity, velocity is dependent on the length and the time. Velocity is dependent on the length and time, and as well as it has magnitude as well as direction, because velocity is a vector quantity. Velocity is a vector quantity, so it has both magnitude as well as direction. So where we will keep this velocity into it? Velocity will be, velocity is the velocity dependent on other quantities? Yes, it is dependent on the displacement and time, which is length and the time taken. So it is a derived quantity. But is it, it is scalar or vector? It is a vector quantity because it has both magnitude as well as direction. So we will keep this velocity into derived and vector. So this velocity will be kept into derived and vector. Now let's come to pressure and work. So what is pressure? What is pressure? It is force per unit area. So students, if we say about the pressure, pressure is the force per unit area. So if we are applying a force, so let's consider if we are applying a force, if a knife is there and a box is there, so which will apply a greater force on this surface? So we have a knife is there and we have the object of mass m. So we have an object of mass m and there is also a knife there. So this is a knife. So knife has the pinpoint, so it will apply a more amount of force per unit area because it has the lesser area in contact. This area is lesser in contact, so pressure is higher here. But here in this case, the area surface is greater, so here the pressure is lower. So pressure, what is pressure? So this is just the explanation of what the concept of pressure. Like what is pressure? Pressure is force per unit area. So when there is lesser space, force per unit is area is greater. So in this case, this pressure, if we see about, so force per unit area is greater. So in the case of knife, so this was just the explanation about the concept of pressure, like how is pressure different from force. It because pressure is dependent on the area and the contact. Pressure is dependent on the area and contact, means lesser area, more force, more pressure is applied. So this pressure is which type of quantity? It is derived quantity, because it is dependent on force and area. So this pressure is dependent on force and area, so it is a derived quantity, as well as it is also a scalar quantity because it has only magnitude. So pressure will come in base and scalar. So pressure will come in, oh sorry, pressure where pressure is a derived quantity. So pressure is a derived quantity. So pressure is a derived quantity, and does it